Welcome to another edition of the Corner Booth Podcast here from the Snowden Delicatessen. I'm Aaron Rand, along with Bill Brownstein of the Gazette, Leslie Chesterman, and our special guest today, PQ leader Paul St-Pierre Plamondon. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it. So we have a lot of ground to cover here.
Let's go.
Let's start with a story that's actually in the news today, and it concerns something that's been in the news generally in Quebec for a while, immigration. The government has come out and said they're looking at cutting their number, which was 50 to 60,000. Your party came out and said you think that number should be about 35,000. Now, you said you're rethinking that. And then, uncharacteristically, I think for you, correct me if I'm wrong, you turned down a chance to discuss this with Quebec Solid, who challenged you to have an actually informed discussion on this. So why did you do that, and what is your stance on immigration right now? Because the argument, of course, we need more immigration. We have a huge labor shortage. Why do you think we should have fewer immigrants?
Okay. So, as for Quebec Solidaire, I had the same episode with Éric Duhem. So, since a few months, now that we're first in the polls, everybody invites me through Twitter to an individual debate on each topic. Bottom line is, I have 3 kids. We're 4 elected members, so a very small party. I will not debate with everyone looking for visibility, looking to improve their profile, their standing. I'm available to debate immigration or any other topic with other leaders of other parties anytime. That's what I've told LCN, who contacted me for such a debate. I said, if Gabriel Nadeau-Dubois, Éric Duhem, if Marc Tanguay are available and you think the topic is worth a debate among leaders, I'm available. But I cannot and I will not start debating with everyone on every single topic. And it started with Éric Duhem. Québec Solidaire uses the same. An interesting fact, we made available our specialist, our spokesperson in immigration, Stéphane Enfield, for a debate with Clich Rivard from Québec Solidaire on the French CBC. And Québec Solidaire declined. So it's to say also that, it is tactics. It is tactics as well. So you want to take a shot at the person who's first in the polls, and it's the name of the game.
Let's talk about immigration generally. So your number is lower than everybody else's. Why? And who would you exclude, and how would it work?
So we have to be careful. The numbers you're talking about is permanent immigration. The topic right now, of course, we have to discuss permanent immigration. I will answer your question. But what I've said clearly last week during our caucus is what has changed since the election of 2022 is that we realize that in terms of housing, the topic of temporary immigration is much more important than permanent immigration. Why? Last year, we had around 60,000 permanent immigrants. At the same time, we had 167 new temporary immigrants for a total of 530,000 on the territory. So if you look at housing and you look offer and demand, we built around 30,000 units of housing for 230,000 new persons on the territory. So at that point, you can play with the blocks as much as you want. It just doesn't correspond. It just doesn't fit. And so we need to discuss responsibly, intelligently of that topic, especially the topic of temporary immigration. I have said in the election of 2022 that for permanent immigration, we think that 35,000 corresponds better to our capacity of housing, integration in French, and public services, a capacity to deliver the services. It is the historical number before Jean Charest raised that figure, saying it would solve the shortage of labor. So that's a lie. There's no correlation between shortage of labor and raising the immigration. It's been done in Ontario, in Quebec for the past 30 years, and it's not solved yet. And that's because a person, whether immigrant or not, a person is a worker and a consumer at the same time. And bottom line, it evens up. It is the same proportion. So we think at 35,000, we're in a historical figure that at that time, if you remember, there was no housing crisis. the situation was pretty stable. I said that we would recalculate, looking at 2026, the next election, we will restart a new sequence of calculations and through which we will put more emphasis on temporary immigration. So we are in that process right now. And the idea here is not to... I don't think there's moral virtue in raising immigration numbers every year. There's moral virtue in hosting fairly and responsibly every person who becomes a Quebecer. If we are at a point where people who come on the territory have no place to go and become homeless, if we are at a point where we have trouble education-wise, for instance, to create classes and provide fair and quality services in terms of education, that's not ethically or morally responsible. So raising, and that's Trudeau's philosophy, it was really like the Century Initiative. We want 100 million Canadians by 2100. There's no moral virtue to that. There's no economic foundation neither, because the idea that it will solve labor shortage has proven to be incorrect. Economists are now confirming that. And there will always be immigration, and that's fair, that's fine. But we have a responsibility to make sure that people have a roof and have services.
Bill?
To get back to your initial point about your 4 members, but you are rising, you are climbing the charts like a bullet, they used to say in music. You're the most popular, becoming the most popular leader in Quebec at this point in time. And you make Monsieur Legault very nervous, I think, because every time you do something, you win a riding.
He's not always very nice to me, no.
No, we've seen that. He's not always very nice to us, too. And we're quite aware of that. He loses a riding to you in Quebec City, and all of a sudden, how does he want to prove that he's more nationalistic than you? Then he takes it out on anglos here. And I'm just very interested, you have 4 seats now with the way things are going. I don't know what the limit is for the next election, but you could well find yourselves in a very interesting position. And what is your theory on what makes Monsieur Legault nervous, A, and B, how would you deal with us upstart anglos and allos here?
I wouldn't say he takes it on anglos. I would say he throws something based on today's poll.
He reacts rather
He reacts with random policies.
Right.
And it's not the same. I don't think he has an intention towards... It's really, if you look at other topics, if we get out of language and immigration and we go to more day-to-day management of the state stuff, when they... Well, first of all, their campaigns were based on popular ideas that was not prepared nor validated by any experts. Most of the time it's the case. But you look at their policies, they tend to react very quickly with a random policy that was not based on consultations, on a really in-depth analysis of what would be a good policy, what would be a mistake. And that creates a lot of fuss, a lot of...
distrust.
Yeah, take for instance the classic topic of the third link, the troisième ligne in Quebec City. Look at my face when I'm entering the Salon Bleu and a journalist says, now that they have lost Jean Talon to you, the Premier François Legault says he's coming back with the third troisième ligne. He's bringing it back. I was in such disbelief. I looked at the journalist and I was thinking he must be mistaken. It must be a joke, so I'll be very careful. And I said, instead of saying this is unacceptable, or I just said, listen, I'll just verify that information and get back to you, because I couldn't. So I think that's the issue. What makes him nervous, to answer your question, I think, is the fact that we work differently. And I think whether people agree or not with what we have put forward so far, they agree that we put a lot of work and pride in delivering the best work we can in terms of preparation, in terms of delivering something rigorous, serious. And I hope it is the end of the Instagram period of politics. Remember Justin Trudeau touring around the world with important leaders from other nations showing his socks and saying, look, my socks are, look at the color, it's so funny. And then taking pictures and delivering that to Instagram, Facebook, and so on. There's been an era in politics where actual public policies didn't matter much to your in terms of probabilities of being elected. Image, very simplistic messages in terms of political communications was becoming the norm, and I think people are fed up with that.
But you do that,
and that's where we come into play.
Your party does. PQ has put those videos out on Twitter or on Instagram.
I've done a lot of long texts, even on Twitter. I bought the blue function, and like my texts are, and people told me like, don't do that because people won't read it. It's false. People actually read everything of it. I had fun on a couple occasions. So for football, I have one Instagram video where I catch footballs, and I love football. But look, in general, my Instagram is a lot of press conferences where I explain my point of view. I'm not into...
But you would like to see that end. You don't think that's a good way for politics to actually be happening right now?
I think social media in general have been a bad news for democracy.
Well, I mean,
in many ways.
Okay.
You look at a lot of American politicians who are trying to use Instagram to appeal to young voters. And a lot of us, I'm putting myself with the young voters, but a lot of us do spend a lot of time on Instagram, and there have been people who have been very effective of getting messages across as well.
Of course, it pays off.
Yeah.
Is it good for democracy if it's an environment where disinformation or propaganda replaces facts?
Right.
It's very bad for democracy.
Right.
So I think it's like anything in a society. We always tend to make certain mistakes, but over time, there's a readjustment that occurs. And I think that's what's happening, and that's a problem with the CAQ, who ran the campaigns based on you get $500. There was a joke running within the PQ of a political ad by the CAQ saying, get 2 free hot dogs with the purchase of 1 soft drink.
Okay.
You know, but a parody of what politics has become if you run on actual dollars that you give people in exchange for their votes. I think this has to come to an end, and I think people are fed up. So it's where the Parti Québécois has a niche or a space that is really unique in that sense.
The Corner Booth podcast is brought to you in part by the Snowden Delicatessen, where we are. 75 years in business, the home of Montreal's greatest smoked meat, plus carnotzel, potato latkes, and the famous Snowden Deli party sandwiches. That's the Snowden Delicatessen.
So I have a big question for you because you are high in the polls now.
Yeah.
We kind of represent a part of Anglophone Montreal. I think traditionally when I voted, I have never voted for the PQ. No offense, I just met you today. Although I do live with a separatist who has only ever voted for the PQ, so it's an interesting couple. But
How long have you been together?
14 years, and we're still together.
Entertaining.
Yes, it is. You should come for dinner one night. But
Actually, I'd be interested.
well, you'll have
And
a
he
good
writes for Le Devoir.
Yeah.
C'était extraordinaire.
Oh.
Yeah. But my big question is, as Anglophones, okay, a lot of us have never voted for the PQ. And we are wary of separatism, of course. This is not news to anybody. I'm wondering, what is your approach to the Anglophone community that could make us one day PQ voters? There are a lot of issues for us. You said just now that Legault is not anti-Anglo, but a lot of us will see these issues like university, the McGill Concordia issue is very, very negative for us. So, you know, first of all, I would like to have your take on the whole university issue. And secondly, what could you propose to the Anglo community that we would one day vote PQ?
Okay, that's a very fast question.
Loaded, I admit. It's a loaded question.
But it's worth the time.
Maybe
so
2 hot dogs and a soft drink.
That's all it takes.
I think that might
No,
work.
you have to throw in a poutine, Aaron.
Or a
I
smoked
want
pizza.
poutine.
Exactly.
I want 2
Exactly.
hot dogs.
It's
Yeah.
like a trio.
Yeah.
I wouldn't accept the one part of your question that says, of course, we're wary of independence. It shouldn't be of course. Obviously, someone, a Quebecer, whether Anglophone or Francophone, can be in agreement or against a society project such as becoming a country. But I don't start with the idea that, of course, as I mentioned during the budget of the Quebec country, if we get back $82 billion in revenue we send to Ottawa every year, of course you need to cut off the direct payments from Ottawa, so then you're down to 52,000 billion a year. And we say, since the public service in Ottawa has grown by 40% since Trudeau's in power, since there are a lot of double missions, a lot of dédoublement, I'm sorry, redundancy, and we can make important savings, can we redirect that money to fundamental direct services to the population, such as healthcare, education, and so on? That concerns everyone. And so I don't start with the idea that Anglophones are against Quebec independence. They have voted against it historically. And then comes your question, well, why should we or could we vote PQ? The best, I cannot decide for people. They are free to vote. As you know, fear has played a big role on both sides in the referendums and in Quebec politics in general. It's the case in Scotland as well. So it's fear of an economic catastrophe if we become a country. It's also fear of how dangerous an autonomous Quebec would be in terms of deciding by ourselves. It used to be that Ottawa is so much more competent than the public service in Quebec. I don't think it holds anymore with the passports and the Phoenix and the gaspillage, the throwing money away.
But Quebec isn't doing so well on that front either. You know?
I think what happens in Ottawa is deterioration, degradation that is obvious to people nowadays. I don't think people assume that a public service that is very far from our needs in Ottawa is more effective than in Quebec. It used to be the case. So what I can do as a leader of the Parti Québécois is make myself available to every Quebecer to explain why I think we have more prosperity and more impact internationally if we do exist, why I think we should build on what we have in common rather than always build on differences. And I think the Canadian model of communitarism is really putting emphasis on identity towards an ethno-cultural group, a religious group, or any subgroup. And for Quebec, it is a real challenge. I don't think we see it that way. So the concept of citizenship in the Parti Québécois and a free Quebec is one where we are all Quebecers and we build on what we have in common. And the most I can do is to make myself available, be responsible, be sharp, work well, and explain why a guy like me, who did his studies at McGill, at Oxford, who obviously can speak English very well. I mean,
better than us.
I speak Danish. It's not like I've been in the basement for the past 25 years, locked up. And I think it's in our interest and it's necessary to become a country. So all I can do is do that responsibly, intelligently, and say to people, at least, if you can listen to why I'm doing this, then it's up to you to decide. But I can't.
But I want to just go back. If you to Leslie's point, Anglos aside, in Quebec, we know historically, and I'm saying historically, say over the last 10 years, within a narrow frame, support for separation has always been at around 30%. You can't win an election provincially if separation is your main cause with that kind of support for separatism.
No, in the past 2 years, we're around 36, 37, 38. We've hit...
You can't win an election with that, can you?
Yeah. We've hit 40%. At 31%, given the last poll, if you project it, yes, you technically speaking, yes, you can win an election.
But can you win a referendum?
I don't.
Which is what you want to do in your first mandate.
Yeah, but I don't do politics like that. I do not. I cannot force people to vote in one way or another. I do not make calculations like this, and I accept that it might be that I never become premier because of what I think is the best interest of Quebec, and yet I will sign. Persister is signer, we say in French. I don't know if the same saying goes in English.
Yes,
I really think it's our best interest, and that in terms of social cohesion, in terms of wealth, in terms of international impact, we are much better off deciding by ourselves based on our own interests, not based on Alberta's oil interest or based on Canada. I'm not against Canada. I actually cheer for Team Canada in hockey or other things. I have several examples coming up in my head as to why I don't oppose Canada. All I'm saying is that actually Jane Jacobs, a very well-known Toronto-based author, she was American, I think, originally, but she lived in Toronto, explained it very well. If you have a too large unit with competing interests and competing realities in one decisional space, well, it is basically a conflict of interest, and historically, because we are not very heavy demographically in Quebec, and because our reality in Quebec is so different from other places in Canada, historically our interest is often disregarded, comes second or third after other provinces. So it's just a recognition that you're always better off deciding based on your own interests than letting other interests decide for you, especially if we have more difficult years ahead in terms of global warming, geopolitical instability. I'd rather have Quebec decide for itself, and I think it concerns Anglophone Quebecers just as Francophone Quebecers. And then that's it. That's what I think. And people can do what they feel they have to do, and it will have results. I do not control the results. I don't know.
Say, just to what you just said now, geopolitical interests, the environment, the economy, these are all concerns for Canadians. How is our reality here, to what you just said, any different from what it is anywhere else in Canada?
When Canada goes abroad and has a commercial mission, it needs to talk about the oil industry of Alberta. It needs to negotiate for the car industry or the nuclear needs of Ontario, for instance, and needs in Quebec, such as forestry. We have water that has a lot of potential in the upcoming years. And when you look how international agreements are being negotiated, at some point when you negotiate with the US, with the European Union, you need to chip in. You need to give in. You need to say, give me this, but yeah, I'll give you that. So when you have a very large unit with competing interests, those arbitrations are political. Take a naval industry. We have the DV industry in Quebec, but the Irving family are very well involved in the Liberal Party of Canada. Look at the figures, the contracts they've gone to the Maritimes. Is it for political? Is there a link with the involvement of the Irving family or not? I have no evidence. But what I can say with certainty is that those are competing interests in a unit, a decisional unit that is so large that a government needs to decide who gets what. And given that Quebec now has a weight where you see it with Poilievre, you don't need to win Quebec anymore to be Prime Minister of Canada. So at that point, it is foreseeable that the interests of Quebec will be disregarded, even more disregarded. And I think we're better off just deciding based on our own interests.
Bill?
It's interesting you point out when Monsieur Levesque started the PQ way back when, he extended an olive branch to, like he really did, to the Anglophone. I mean, it was people, Gérard Gaudin, people like that, really made an effort. And then more and more over the years, not in your circles, it came to appear to a lot of us Anglos, we are the enemy. And the interesting thing is that so many Anglos who are still here have learned not only to adapt, but to embrace.
They are francophiles.
Embrace. I mean, it's
Obviously.
a completely different situation than it was in Monsieur Levesque's time.
Totally. That's why I don't start with the premise that people are not interested. The situation is totally different. In terms also of an immigration that comes from so many nations and I think also people get used to talk about certain topics without being as emotional. My whole family voted no in '95, and in my own family, the topic was such that my father refused to drive me to the voting poll. I was 18 years old and I had to walk. So I think things have changed. Like, people talk about those topics nowadays, and I mean, it is more intellectual and less. So I agree. Sorry, I interrupted you, but I fully agree that things have changed in that front.
I mean, the fact is, Montreal is a multicultural. Look, you've lived in multicultural cities. You've been in London. You've been in Scandinavia, and everywhere else. You can be embracing of French culture. You can be perfectly bilingual, but yet we have to celebrate. And there's many other cultures that do exist here, have existed here for a long time.
Yep.
And I think in some circles it's seen as like, well, this is a detriment to Quebec society that we have a multicultural. More in Montreal, obviously, because in the rest of the province, that's not really an issue. And how do you deal with that kind of situation?
Well, if you look at European countries right now, it is true that in most Western countries there's a detachment between cities and the rural conception of what is common living, what is a society. I don't see it as positive if cities are totally detached from the rest of their territory. I don't see how it serves us. So I think differences are positive. They bring to the table things, but it cannot be disconnection. Disconnection means that you have actual no contact with Quebec's very specific culture. Disconnection means that you start fearing, and sometimes, because of course I get my information in all media, including English-speaking media. Sometimes I think we create fear. I give you an example. Well, when Quebec Community Group says Bill 96 is like Russia attacking Ukraine, it's comparable to the situation of Ukraine, it is so irresponsible because it creates fear. It really creates fear. And you can disagree with Bill 96. I intervened myself on certain aspects of 96 that I thought was counterproductive. I intervened myself on universities for Bishop because I thought, well, Bishop is really a situation aside, and we have a historic community who deserve to have a functional institution. So you can disagree with Bill 96, but you cannot say things like it's exactly like in Ukraine. Oh. It's so we have to be careful in how we give in to fear. Unfortunately, and it has nothing to do with Francos or Anglos in Quebec, if you look at how democracy are evolving around the world, I think we are detaching ourselves from fact. Ideologies, or whether it's radical right or radical left, are taking much more space to the detriment of actual objectivity. And that's worrying me. I think one can say I'm pretty much center-left, classic social democrat. I really think that if we want to reassure people, we need to do what we are doing right now, to start with. Discussions based on policies, facts, options, point of views that will be different, but based on what you see as a model that would be positive, what I see as a model that would be positive. But we need to get as far as possible from declarations, and really you see it right wing and left wing. It's not declarations that are not based on fact, but will trigger fear or anger. That's so counterproductive in a society. So that's one key point, whether it's Francophone or Anglophone media, Francophone or Anglophone politicians. We saw it with Polièvre recently with the mayors, Plante and Marchand. There's really a challenge for us in the upcoming years, given these things, because it all starts with X and with these new technologies. I think it didn't used to be like this.
But on that front too, sorry, Aaron, but there is so much talk, which actually we are all very understanding of, is protecting the French language, and we're seen as too much English in Montreal. You can't get served. all these things, but don't you think the larger défi, the bigger problem, is competing with American culture, with Netflix, with phones?
Totally.
And I have 2 young kids, and I just see that who went to French school, and all these kids are absorbed in American culture. It's not even Canadian. They're not listening to Gordon Lightfoot. You know what I mean?
And you know that the CRTC decides for those topics. So Quebec has no decision power.
Right.
On top of it, Quebec has no representation on that board.
But you wouldn't want to have those things eliminated either. I was just listening to Radio Canada, and they were reviewing all these English shows.
No, but you can have policies.
Challenge.
If you decide by yourself, you can have policies that counterbalance what I see as a form of imperialism, cultural imperialism. It's not me who said that. It's actually Catherine Tate from the CBC. She said, we're facing cultural standardization, cultural imperialism from the US and Great Britain around the world. So it's actually ironical because what it does, it hinders diversity from a cultural and linguistic standpoint. What is the response is to have your own policies, what Quebec can do if we're not a country, that creates homemade products. The classic in French is passe-partout, who's been developed by scientists in the 70s, saying what is the best for our children. I have a lot of trouble with what my kids are seeing in the morning right now, because it's all the same fast-moving, high in color, and really simplistic programs. Paw Patrol being one of them. Right. And unfortunately, during the campaign, one of the headlines was, the PQ wants to abolish the Paw Patrol, and it was not actually what I said. I said we could produce our own things that are more rich in terms of educational content.
Right.
So you can have national policies that address those issues. I think you are correct to say that it is the biggest challenge. But bottom line is, we don't have those powers.
Right.
We have limited powers. We do have powers to spend more in producing our own programs, but the regulation, the CRTC, is not within our power, and that's one of the reasons among many reasons why I think we should decide by ourselves.
But you also studied in English, so as much as we understand controlling the amount of English coming in, you obviously had very elite, beneficial education in English.
Yes.
Do you endorse that for Quebec students who could follow in your footsteps?
Well, I did my CEGEP in French, and then I decided to do the law program at McGill. I think it's an illusion to think that at the university level, English will not be an international language over the next years.
Right.
So I've never discouraged learning languages, and I actually can speak more or less to a certain level.
So you're for bilingualism?
Yes.
For Quebecers?
On an individual basis, knowledge of languages is useful.
Right.
Where we need policies, culturally or in the education system, is when English becomes the common language of socialization or of workplace. And the mentality, if we get back to Lévesque, the mentality or the philosophy was to say, in a few environments where because of the pressure of being only 2% of francophones within North America and this new pressure of globalization that occurs in English, if we don't say to ourselves that the workplace or certain education moments where we are together occur in French, there's no reasonable probability of survival of the French language based on the experience of Canadian provinces. Because if you look at what happened to the French language in Manitoba, everywhere, I mean, it's obvious. And so it's balancing a fair amount of regulation with individual freedoms and preserving English-speaking institutions who have a root and, of course, a legitimacy in Quebec. I think it's feasible to balance that. I also said that I think that the topic would be less sensitive in a free Quebec. Because once you become a country, then Anglophones become fully a minority. Within Canada, I'm told very often, this is a bilingual country, so deal with it. people who are hostile to the PQ will say that to the Parti Québécois. Once in a free country, an autonomous Quebec, I think the approach through regulation will change and will be reduced. I think the institutions as well will change, because then you are faced as a francophone to a very important question. If we suffered through centuries from discrimination, deportations, and laws that prevented to go to school in French, such as in Ontario, they apologize for that, but yet that's what happened. Are we going to do the same mistakes? It is a fundamental question, and the obvious answer, and you look worldwide, those who didn't answer that question correctly are having problems that are unsolvable. The correct question is, no, we're going to do better, and that's why it becomes a prosperous or a promising society project. You create a country because you believe that things can get better, that writing a new chapter can actually generate new solutions. It's fair to say that since the Middle Age, humanity has improved in terms of human rights. Let's think of the Middle Age. I'm yet in the mentality, although it's not a period that is very optimistic, but I'm yet in the mentality that we can improve as humanity. And for me, creating a country is a new chapter that really is an occasion, like take the First Nations. It's the perfect occasion to abolish the Indian Act. And to say to First Nations, listen, you're a nation, we bring in the United Nations, and we start negotiating nation to nation, because we think we can create a durable model where we live aside and we have respect for each other. So writing a new chapter creates all those opportunities. That's among the reasons why I think we're better off changing things and creating a society project than to stay within a colonial-based system that is Canada.
I want to come back because we have to wrap up in a couple of minutes.
Yeah, I'm sorry, my answers
No,
are
that's okay.
all over.
Narrow this sort of focus down. I have two questions. Number one, you talked about, and I know it's in your platform, you mentioned the CRTC. You want to have basically a QRTC, right? So it's a provincial organization. And I would ask, would that then mean that English media in this province would fall under a QRTC provincially because we're here, and what does that mean for their future, potentially? And number two, you brought up the case of bishops. I find this interesting. We spent a lot of time talking about the issues over tuition hikes at McGill and Concordia. You said you were concerned about bishops. When the CAC introduced this tuition hike and these restrictions, et cetera, what was your reaction then? Why is it okay for bishops? And I understand there's a different community there, but did you support the idea of these tuition hikes from McGill and Concordia? And if the rationale for that was because it would increase funding for French universities, clearly that's not going to happen. We're seeing applications down roughly 30%. There will be no extra money. So was that a fallacy to begin with?
Well, of course, if you verify that it actually doesn't work, then you fix it. So I don't think that policy from the CQ was elaborated longly. That's what we discussed a bit earlier. I agree with the objective of giving a fair amount of funding to Francophone universities as compared to English-speaking universities, because it is a measurable fact that they are less funded. If that approach based on tuition fee, because another principle that I agree with is taxpayers in Quebec shouldn't finance cheaper education for provinces that chose to pay less taxes and thus have higher tuition fees. We have no means to finance everyone in Canada. We made more social democrat choices in Quebec. It reflects in the tuition fee. And then if 2 years down the road you realize that the objective that is legitimate to make sure that it's fair in terms of financing is not achieved, I'm open to modify that policy. So I was never consulted on how they proceeded. I was a bit surprised because we didn't see it coming, like it was a bit coming. So I agree on the principles, but I'm not sure the way it was put in place will actually achieve the objective, in
Also
which case...
not consulting the
Yeah,
universities.
but like the whole raison d'etre also was that, according to Monsieur Legault, Madame Derry, was that there was less French, too much English being spoken in the streets of Montreal, and there's never been a study that actually proved that. Because
What was your reaction when Jean-François Robert said that? When you heard him say, "There's too much English," he hears too much English on the streets of downtown Montreal.
Sure, when
Well, there's one figure that we can use figures to a certain extent. What happened is we told universities, if you want money, bring in students. So of course their incentive, but that's also true in Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean. Their incentive is to bring as many foreign students as possible so as to get funding because they are underfunded. So the root of the problem is the method of financing. Of course, if Concordia and McGill, they see that, and if you look at the revenues from international students, they have been on the rise very steeply. So they really made more money by bringing more students. They are students that usually don't speak French. And the idea that they will spend their time taking French classes and that will change the ecosystem from a linguistic standpoint in Montreal, I don't think it's realistic. A level 4 French course gives you maybe the possibility to order a coffee in French, but that's it. So it is true that if you raise and you raise and you raise the number of students who don't know French because you're dependent on that funding, then the problem, I mean, it has a linguistic impact. I have not measured it myself, but obviously it has an impact at some point. But the root of the problem is the method of financing of your universities. If you think that your mission is to give accessible and quality services to students of Quebec, and you want a share of students coming from abroad, then you need to determine what's that proportion and how you get a decent level of financing to every university. But I think what universities are doing right now is just to raise the number of international students all the time because they are looking for that money. And it's an issue. I think it has an impact linguistically. I'm not sure to what level, but obviously if you have 10,000 more next year, 10,000 more persons and it's also geographical. It's between Atwater Station and Saint Laurent Station on the Green Line.
Right.
So of course it has an impact, but the solution, I think, is in the way we finance universities. They are in a trap where they need financing, and so they will promote more and more and more international students to levels that have never been seen before.
The impact you're describing from Atwater to Saint Laurent, is that impact that there's too much English being heard? Is that the impact? What's the impact?
I'm not into too much English being heard. That has no factual or scientific basis. Yeah, but I'm not the CQ. So
He didn't say it.
Exactly. I'll leave that to them.
What do you think of that?
I'm into data. So you can look at figures in terms of what language is used in the workplace, polls about what language is used on a daily basis, cultural consumption, which is a really big chunk
Huge.
of the situation. Among Francophones, first place.
Huge. Yeah.
So the data is showing that the French language is not recul is
Backing up.
Is backing up. And it's specific.
Progressing?
It's not progressing, obviously, and that's a dynamic that is in Laval and Montreal. That's, I think, certain. And then it's coming up with policies that are intelligent. And in the terms of university, I think the debate is about how we finance universities. And once universities, they have decent financing, we can have intelligent planning of the proportion between students from Quebec, students from the rest of Canada, and students from abroad. But right now, there's no planning because universities, they're in a mood. I can understand why they're doing that. They're just, I need financing, so I'll go all in with what you give me. We want to reform that.
I think also we can't forget that a lot of people go to McGill because it's got an amazing reputation. And even you chose McGill over a Francophone university because it has an amazing
reputation. But it is also...
The reputation plays for a lot.
Yes, but it's easy when you get much more financing, when you get a deed of $1 billion by the government of Quebec to have the Victoria
Yes, but this didn't happen overnight. McGill's had a great reputation for decades.
Yeah, but
and
if you look at the funding, they have a net advantage towards other universities. So if you look at Université de Montréal, Université Laval, I don't want to name them all, but they have the same potential of excellence, maybe in a different environment because they are francophone. But if they compete with unequitable funding, then the competition is a bit rigged. So I think there should be equitable, fair funding for every university. But the way we're funding universities right now create those debates that can be very different if we change the way
although
of
the
financing.
Quebec government is spending a lot of money on recruiting in francophone countries to have people come here as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think that's a different
Yet
topic.
those same French universities, Université de Laval, everybody except UQAM, came out actually to support the English universities and say this is a bad idea.
So, in politics, there's determining the objective, and then we can debate if an objective is legitimate or not. But determining the right strategy or the right objective doesn't give you a good policy. Then there's determining what's the right policy to achieve the objective. And by the time there's an election in 2026, we'll have a clear picture as to whether that law, that bill from the CAQ, actually achieved the objective they named, they mentioned at the very beginning. And what I'm telling you is if it doesn't achieve the objectives, we will change it.
Okay. Last question, and we have to go. I want to ask, and we talked about this before, this idea, and Francois Legault's been spending, I think, a lot of time talking about this. He's concerned with mother tongue spoken in the home. And I think for a lot of people, the reaction, certainly from people I've heard from, is the government has no business telling me or expecting me whatever language I want to speak at home. Is that a concern?
Well, ironically, the problem comes from Statistics Canada. So the way that data evolved over time, Statistics Canada has always used language spoken at home as the definition of usual language. Then you have other measures. So you have language at work, language of cultural consumption, language as a consumer. You have so what we've done at the Parti Québécois is use all of them. But when you look at the data given by Statistics Canada, and they're not neither nationalist or independentist, obviously, they use that because historically it's been considered the most reliable indicator. It's true that it's not a perfect indicator because the reality is much more complex than that, especially in a situation where people can have 3 languages that they master very well. So you need to use multiple indicators, one of which is language of at work and language of cultural consumption, but they're also down. They're also not improving in terms of French language for reasons of globalization and of demographic change, because the linguistic transfers of immigrants over in the past decades, it's about 50-50. It's 45% will use English as their primary language over time, 55%. If you want a stable French language in Quebec, you would need to be around 90% of linguistic transfer. So all these factors, they come into play. But we need to use all measures, not one measure.
Well, an interesting reality is now I'm ending up speaking to other anglos in French more than when I start a
Ça arrive,
conversation.
évidemment. Bien sûr, ça arrive. mais c'est ça que... That's why I...
No, but it's just a different reality.
Yeah,
from
and they don't
years
start
ago.
speaking to you in English. They keep going in
We
French.
keep going. I don't know that they're Franco or Anglo. They don't know what I am, and then we end up. It's an interesting reality.
Yeah. I think we need to be able to discuss the quality of public policies. I campaigned for the independence with Anglophones in Quebec because I start with the idea that if you stayed in Quebec over decades, over referendums, there's a part of you as an Anglophone who agree that there's a specific reality to Quebec that has some value. Otherwise, Canada offers another model that, by the way, that has not been very respectful of the French language as a minority language in other provinces. So that's why You can never take anything for granted in politics. See, for instance, we won Jean Talon for the first time in PQ's history. And those who voted Parti Québécois were persons who told us that they never voted PQ in their whole life. So you have no guarantees in politics. There's no way to foresee outcomes. And you must not start with ideas that are preconceived, because things change and you don't know. So that's why whether we talk about polls, about Quebec as an independent country, universities, my focus is to deliver well-thought and quality interventions, and then you don't control the rest.
And on that note, we will say thank you.
Merci.
We appreciate you coming today. By the way, welcome
Next
to the
time.
Snowden Delicatessen.
Yes, thank you,
First time here.
and I'm available for dinners.
Good debate at the table.
That wraps up another edition of the Corner Booth from the Snowden Deli. We thank our guest, Paul St-Pierre Plamondon. We'll see you again soon.